and fly off to the Himalayan peaks. Fly off to a place that's been shrouded in mystery for centuries, a place some folks call Shangri-La, that's actually moved from the survival base of the pyramid to becoming a transformation role model for the world. I went to Bhutan. The teenage king of Bhutan was also a curious man, but this was back in 1972, when he ascended to the throne 2 days after his father passed away. At age 17, he started asking the kind of questions that you'd expect of someone with a beginner's mind. On a trip through India, early in his reign as king, he actually was asked by an Indian journalist about the Bhutanese GDP, the size of the Bhutanese GDP. And the king responded in a fashion that actually has transformed us 4 decades later. He said the following. He said, "Why are we so obsessed and focused with gross domestic product? Why don't we care more about gross national happiness?" Now, in essence, the king was asking us to consider an alternative definition of success, what has come to be known as GNH, or gross national happiness. Most world leaders didn't take notice, and those that did thought this was just Buddhist economics. But the king was serious, and this was a notable moment, because this is the first time a world leader in almost 200 years had suggested that that intangible of happiness, again, that leader 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence, 200 years later, this king was suggesting that intangible of happiness is something we should measure, and it's something that we should actually value as government officials. For the next 3 decades, next 3,000 years as king, this king actually started measuring and managing around happiness in Bhutan, and including just recently taking his country from being an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy with no bloodshed, no coup. And Bhutan, for those of you who don't know it, is the newest democracy in the world just 2 years ago. So as I spent time with leaders in the GNH movement, I got to actually really understand what they were doing, and I got to spend some time with the Prime Minister. Over dinner, I asked him an impertinent question. I asked him, how can you create and measure something which evaporates? In other words, happiness. And he's a very wise man, and he said, listen, Bhutan's goal is not to create happiness. We create the conditions for happiness to occur. In other words, we create a habitat of happiness. Wow, that's interesting. And he said that they have a science behind that art, and they've actually created 4 essential pillars, 9 key indicators, and 72 different metrics that actually help them to actually measure their GNH. In fact, one of those key indicators is, how do the Bhutanese feel about how they spend their time each day? It's a good question. How do you feel about how you spend your time each day? Time is one of the scarcest resources in the modern world, and yet, of course, that little intangible piece of data doesn't factor into our GDP calculations. So as I spent my week up in the Himalayas, actually I started to imagine what I call an emotional equation. And it focuses on something I read long ago from a guy named Rabbi Hyman Schachtel. How many know him? Anybody? 1954, he wrote a book called The Real Enjoyment of Living. And he suggested that happiness is not about having what you want. Instead, it's about wanting what you have. Or in other words, I think the Bhutanese believe happiness equals wanting what you have, imagine gratitude, divided by having what you want, gratification. The Bhutanese aren't on some aspirational treadmill, constantly focused on what they don't have. Their religion, their isolation, their deep respect for their culture, and now the principles of their GNH movement all have actually fostered a sense of gratitude about what they do have. How many of us here as Tedsters in the audience spend more of our time in the bottom half of this equation, in the denominator? We are a bottom-heavy culture in more ways than one. The reality is, in Western countries, quite often we do focus on the pursuit of happiness, as if happiness is something that we have to go out, an object that we're supposed to get, or maybe many objects. Actually, in fact, if you look in the dictionary, many dictionaries define pursuit as to chase with hostility. Do we pursue happiness with hostility? Good question. But back to Bhutan. Bhutan's actually bordered on its north and south by 38% of the world's population. Could this little country, like a startup in a mature industry, be the spark plug that actually influences a 21st century of middle class in China and India? Bhutan's actually created the ultimate export, a new global currency of well-being. And there are 40 countries around the world today that are actually studying their own GNH. You may have heard this last fall, Nicolas Sarkozy in France announcing the results of an 18-month study by 2 Nobel economists focusing on happiness and wellness in France. Sarkozy suggested that world leaders should stop myopically focusing on GDP and consider a new index, what some French are calling a joie de vivre index. I like it. Co-branding opportunities. And just 3 days ago here at TED, we actually had a simulcast of David Cameron, potentially the next Prime Minister of the UK, actually quoting one of my favorite speeches of all time, Robert Kennedy's poetic speech from 1968, when he suggested that we're myopically focused on the wrong thing and that GDP is a misplaced metric. So it suggests that the momentum is shifting. I've taken that Robert Kennedy quote and I've actually turned it into a new balance sheet for just a moment here. This is actually a collection of things that Robert Kennedy said in that quote. GDP counts everything from air pollution to the destruction of our redwoods, but it actually doesn't count the health of our children or the integrity of our public officials. As you look at these 2 columns here, doesn't it make you feel like it's time for us to actually start figuring out a new way to count, a new way to actually imagine what's important to us in life? Certainly Robert Kennedy suggested at the end of his speech exactly that. He said GDP measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. Wow. So how do we do that? Well, let me say one thing we could just start doing 10 years from now, at least in this country. Why in the heck in America are we doing a census in 2010? We're spending $10 billion on a census, and we're asking 10 simple questions. It is simplicity, but all of those questions are tangible. They're about demographics, they're about where you live, how many people you live with, and whether you own your home or not. That's about it. We're not asking meaningful metrics. We're not asking important questions. We're not asking anything that's intangible. Abe Maslow said long ago something you've heard before, but you didn't realize it was him. He said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. We've been fooled by our tool. Excuse that expression. We've been fooled by our tool. GDP has been our hammer, and our nail has been a 19th and 20th century industrial era model of success. And yet 64% of the world's GDP today is in that intangible industry we call service, the service industry, the industry I'm in. And only 36% is in the tangible industries of manufacturing and agriculture. So maybe it's time that we get a bigger toolbox, right? Maybe it's time we actually get a toolbox that doesn't just count what's easily counted, the tangible in life, but actually counts what we most value, the things that are intangible. I guess I'm sort of a curious CEO. I was also a curious economics major as an undergrad, and I learned that economists measure everything in tangible units of production and consumption as if each of those tangible units is exactly the same. They aren't the same. In fact, as leaders, what we need to learn is that we can actually influence the quality of that unit of production by actually creating the conditions for our employees to live their calling. And in fact, in Vivian's case, her unit of production isn't the tangible hours she works, it's the intangible difference she makes during that 1 hour of work. This is Dave Erringdale, who's actually been a longtime guest at Vivian's Motel. He stayed there 100 times in the last 20 years. And he's loyal to the property because of the relationship that Vivian and her fellow employees have created with him. They've created a habitat of happiness for Dave. And he tells me that he can always count on Vivian and his staff and the staff there to make him feel at home. Why is it that business leaders and investors quite often don't see the connection between creating the intangible of employee happiness with creating the tangible of financial profits in their business? We don't have to choose between inspired employees and sizable profits. We can have both. And in fact, inspired employees quite often help make sizable profits, right? So what the world needs now, in my opinion, is business leaders and political leaders who know what to count. We count numbers. We count on people. What really counts is when we actually use our numbers to truly take into account are people. I learned that from a maid in a motel and a king of a country. What can you start counting today? What one thing can you start counting today that actually would be meaningful in your life, whether it's your work life or your business life? Thank you very much.